I think it's so interesting because most people would consider eyewitness testimony as well as confessions to be really sort of like the gold standard of like those that like when you have that evidence, then you really got them. But you're talking about how witnesses, they make mistakes, they can also be subject to their own biases. And I think a lot of people probably couldn't understand the idea of why someone would confess to a crime that they didn't commit. But I seem to recall seeing, like, I think it was like a Dateline NBC show or something, and they talked to guys who had given false confessions. And they were saying that, like, you know, they're kept in these interrogation rooms for hours. They have no idea, like, if they're ever going to get out, if they're ever going to see their family again. And that after hours and hours of interrogation, they kind of go crazy. And they're like, well, maybe I did do it. Or, you know, I don't remember every single thing about that night in question. Or either that, or their brain just gets fried, or they just want, you know, this interrogation to end. Like what have you come across in terms of false confessions?
Well, that's exactly true. You know, I mentioned before having met prisoners and heard from prisoners who were actually physically tortured into giving false confessions, but it doesn't even have to reach that level. An exonerated prisoner I know here in New York who wasn't on death row but could have been had New York had the death penalty in that era. He was a young kid at the time. He was a teenager accused of killing a classmate, and he, for whatever reason, was considered a suspect, was brought in for questioning, and was questioned for something like, you know, for days straight, pretty much. Wasn't given food, was denied water, he was a guy with kind of, you know, who was kind of socially awkward, and they intimidated him. And he eventually ended up confessing to this crime, even though he hadn't committed it. And once you've confessed to a crime that you haven't committed, I mean, it is so hard. It is so hard, precisely for, as you mentioned, people can't wrap their heads around the idea that you would ever confess to something as that you didn't do, let alone something so horrific as that. But the reality is that it's way more common than people realize. In cases that have been overturned through DNA evidence that actually played a role in I think 25%, a quarter of cases involve wrongful false confessions. And this is actually something I've written about quite a bit. And I in my research and in my just everyday sort of activism and knowing prisoners, I've known many men who gave false confessions. And again, it seems illogical, but it plays a really insidious role, and so often comes at the hands of police officers who use truly brutal interrogation techniques. And the real tragedy also is that those who are most susceptible, those who are most likely to give a false confession, are people who are very young or who have some mental deficiency, who have, you know, are more willing or more eager to please, or to say to say whatever it is that they need to say to get out of this frightening situation, or to please this authority figure. So it's quite cruel the way that operates. But you're absolutely right. There's a growing consciousness also, I think, around this issue.